join us. All right, well, as people keep rolling in, I'm going to get at least started with introductions because we've got lots to do today. We're here for an hour and a half, and I'm really excited to dive into this topic. So some of you are familiar with the Education Upended series, which we did starting in April of the pandemic of 2020. Kind of an informal conversations around what's been going on in your districts. This has evolved into this new iteration of interviews and conversations with special guests once a month. And so we branded it still with the Education Upended, but talking out of turn. And Ingrid is the lucky winner of being my first guest, and she's also my colleague. I'm so excited to have her here. She works with me at Paces Connection, and I'll let her say a little bit about her role and introduce herself.
Thanks, Laura. I'm currently the Director of Communities at Paces Connection, and I'm also a consultant that focuses on historical trauma and diversity, equity, inclusion for the most part, along with health equity. And many of my clients are schools, private and public. And so I'm very excited to be here today and have this conversation.
Thanks, Ingrid. Oh, we have Scotland with us. You may win the prize for farthest abroad. It's so exciting to have people from around the world. Welcome. All right, so I'm gonna just get us going here. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Paces Connection if you're not familiar with us. Most of you hopefully are, but we're a social online community working towards creating a much better normal. And we use this formula for PACES, following PACES science. PACES is positive and adverse childhood experiences. We used to be just ACEs Connection, but we changed to include the impact of positive childhood experiences as well. So these are really the focus of our science is epidemiology, the impact on the brain, impact on the body, the study of epigenetics, and resilience. This is the frame we use for our work. We support communities around the world. We've got communities all over working to solve our most intractable problems. We've got, like I said, over 400 communities and over 52,000 members, which is super exciting. That's really growing quickly. We educate people, we engage the public, we connect with individuals. These are our lovely staff. Such a wonderful group of people to work with. And if there isn't, you can look on our page and find a community near you. And if there's not one, you can start one. And there's information on our website on how to do that. So for us, PACES Science is a social justice issue. And for me, as the education consultant for PACES Connection, this is definitely true. This absolutely relates to the work that we are focused on in education. So with our topic today, I'm just going to kind of set the stage for why this for me rose to the top as one of the first topics that we should dive into in this new series. At least 8 states have passed legislation banning the teaching of critical race theory in their school districts, and at least 20 more have similar bills in the pipeline or plan to introduce them. Some examples of what they're legislating, and teachers risk their jobs and worse if they violate this new legislation. Banning of specific books at all grade levels. History topics are forbidden to talk about. Certain language is censored. You cannot use certain words in the classroom. And no DEI focus is allowed at the district level. So this is having a dramatic effect on policy across the country in districts. And I personally know quite a few teachers that are being affected directly in having to change their curriculum and censor their language. Some communities are threatening teachers on social media, even if it's not legislated in their state, publicly rallying for their termination and labeling them activists, communists, all sorts of things, anti-American, but really maligning their personal personal life through social media. And South Dakota just delayed their social studies standards review to allow constituents to weigh in and give their opinion on what kind of social studies should be taught and what should not be taught. And the governor is going to ask the legislature to pass legislation banning critical race theory and action civics, which has become also the new word. So what the heck is going on? Like, what, this is serious stuff here that's really having a big impact on our schools and on our education. So I'm going to hand it over to Ingrid for a while, and she's going to help set the context for why race matters in the PACES education movement. And what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Why is this our focus? And then we're going to go over some context setting for all of us, some language, and then we're going to open it up and stop sharing the screen and hopefully have a really robust discussion with the group. So hang on there with us while we embark on this journey. All right, Ingrid.
So yes, when we think about, why race is involved in this discussion and why it's such a hot button topic, it really comes down to ACEs at the root, as a root problem, as a root cause. And so in America, we have had a great deal of racial trauma. And so this is where we have created issues around identity through the social construct of race, and have allowed it to get to the point where, there's certain embedded beliefs in our society around who is worthy, who gets priority, who is discriminated against, and things of that nature. And this has led to what we call racial trauma. This is just like any other trauma, with the exception that it is tied to identity. And so racial trauma is a mental or emotional injury. It results in classic PTSD-like symptoms, and it is most impactful on descendants of slaves, African Americans, and indigenous peoples. You can go to the next one, Laura. And so racial trauma in the past, especially, has caused what we call historical trauma, or trauma that is passed along through generations. This happens in a lot of different ways. So it can happen through, first, parenting practices, obviously. So parents parent their children in a way that allows them to be racially socialized into their environment. And so if you think about what type of parenting practices a slave mother would have to use to prepare her child for slavery, what type of parenting practices a mother, African-American mother during Jim Crow, would have to use to keep their child safe when we have night riders and lynchings and things of this nature. And this has warped parenting practices over hundreds of years to be extremely survival-based. And also it has taken on the role of basically telling children of color the rules that they have to play to be safe and to succeed in America. And these are not the same rules that white children are going to get from their parents, if their parents are talking about race at all. So historical trauma is defined as a multi-generational trauma that's experienced by a specific cultural group, and it is passed along from generation to generation through parenting, through social learning, through maladaptive coping, and also through epigenetics. And we can go to the next slide, Lauren. So this term was coined in the 80s by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and she called it a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan across generations, emanating from a massive group trauma. And so the two groups that have extensive historical trauma that reflects in not only their current, not only in the historical events of slavery and genocide, but also in their current social determinants of health, life expectancy, economic disadvantage. The two groups that are impacted the most are African Americans and Indigenous peoples. And Dr. Braveheart also says that this is accompanied by historically unresolved grief. So all of these, the things that we associate with ACEs already, like poor health and social issues like issues around educational achievement, economic disadvantage, and all the different ways that we know that ACEs manifest today, like chronic disease, mental health issues. All of this you can see are more likely to occur in African Americans and Indigenous peoples today. And this is a reflection of historical trauma. You can go to the next slide. And so when we look at historically traumatic events, I want to be very clear, and we'll talk about this more later, but race is a social construct. So it is not about skin color, it is about environment. And so all of these events can happen with any group of people. It just so happens that these events are more likely to impact people who have already been deemed less than by the social construct of race. So we have historically traumatic events that we know has had a real impact on Americans throughout generations. As you can see, genocide, so this would be specific to Indigenous peoples. Chattel slavery would be specific to African Americans. Mass incarceration impacts most people of color, but especially Indigenous, Black, and Latino communities. Forced relocation and displacement. This impacts really anyone dealing with poverty. 9/11 and other terrorist events. We just had the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And so it's very easy to see how that is considered a historically traumatic event for all Americans and probably people across the world. Jim Crow, poverty, you will see natural disasters and pandemics there. So pandemics are considered a historical trauma, which means that we are currently in a collective trauma that has the potential to become a historical trauma with COVID-19. Racism, economic downturns, police brutality, community violence, wars, and the stripping of cultural identity and practices, which is something that should stand out for this discussion specifically, because when we think about cultural practices, cultural identity in America, through the process of education, children of color learn to assimilate. And that's ultimately the purpose of American education, is to promote what we call American exceptionalism and this colorblind melting pot notion of America, which is not exactly true. And obviously, as a country, we'll go through great lengths to keep this narrative going. And this whole idea of critical race theory seems to threaten that. Go to the next one. And so groups who are most impacted by historical trauma, as you can see here, I won't name them all, but I want you to look at them and reflect on intersectionality. So thinking about African-American children, LGBTQI individuals of color, war veterans of color, and definitely people of color who are living in poverty. Where these different groups intersect increases vulnerability. You can go to the next slide. And so what are the symptoms? Some of these are very pertinent to education. And you already, if you're in the field and working with kids, you already are quite aware of the symptoms of historical trauma. So there's vulnerability to PTSD and other stress disorders. Overall, an increase in poor mental health outcomes, more likely to display irritation and violence, to be victims or perpetrator of violence, domestic violence, child abuse, higher incarceration rates, poverty, and also the obvious impact on educational achievement. Another thing is going to be that stands out, especially when it comes to education, are going to be behavioral problems in childhood, definitely lower IQ, which is an issue that is implicated in epigenetics for sure, but then also environments that are conducive to learning, home environments that are conducive to learning. And then relationship difficulties. One thing in my work with schools, teachers often talk about how difficult it may be to form connections with children of color. And in general, groups who have experienced historical trauma have relationship difficulties with their parents, with people in authority, to include teachers, with their significant others, boyfriends, girlfriends. And so this is something that is very common and probably the most impactful symptom, because as we know, our relationships are deeply tied to, our relationships really foster our resilience. And so when we look at the systems level of stress and trauma and ACEs and healing, the Rise Center does a great job of helping us to think through what are the factors that are causing distress and trauma within our society in a systematic way, and then what healing and liberation look like systematically as well. And so when it comes to teachers and schools in general, it's really going to be two areas where this is important. Obviously, all of these are important, but definitely community in place. This is where schools live. Schools are embedded within communities. And so the ability to combat a child's environmental stressors when it comes to race and poverty should be addressed in the school setting in the way of radical inquiry and popular education and culture building. So not asserting cultural hegemony or that there's only one way to be American, but by celebrating a child's individual culture, helping them to tie to their cultural understanding and culture building, and then also engaging in radical inquiry, which hopefully we'll do a little bit today, which is truth-telling, which is saying, when you look around your neighborhood and you think to yourself, because most of the people in the neighborhood look like you, that your issues are somehow tied to genetic race or skin color, as opposed to the systemic issues that have impacted your neighborhood, like redlining and discrimination, and racist policies, along with hundreds of years of the construction of race and tying it to behaviors, and also this idea of which races are civilized and which races are savages. All of that is at play. If you do not engage in radical inquiry, then students will be left to believe that it is their race that is the only factor in why their neighborhoods look different from others, or why there's more crime in their neighborhood, or the other poor outcomes that come along with our mostly minority communities. Not only that, but schools should be engaging in popular education, helping children to think through what type of education they want, what subjects they're interested in, and making them really engage in critical thinking. And as long as schools are not doing that, then they begin to perpetuate this idea of American exceptionalism, that if you just work hard or pull yourself up by your bootstraps or only make good decisions, then you'll be fine. As opposed to, there are very structured, long-standing systems that are impacting our children of color and our children that are living in poverty, and that those systems are not just accidental. They just don't happen, that they have been crafted with the purpose of ensuring that the rich get richer and that men are in power, especially white men are in power. Another area is going to be systems and institutions. This is where policy comes in. And so different policies that are rooted in racism often have racist outcomes. And so thinking through what does it mean for our policies to be healing centered and restorative, and how do we power share with students and with communities. You can go to the next one. And so at the core of this issue is really racial identity. And this is why we see this issue so differently as two separate groups. So we have very clear models from Dr. Janet Helms around racial identity development in white people. I like Dr. Helms because she is one of few people who has decided to tackle racial identity in white people when so much of our research in the field of psychology, social work, education is deficit focused on people of color. So we're doing a lot of examination of Black families, Latino families, and examining the deficits and the gaps in achievement when it comes to education. However, we rarely look at white people and determine what does it look like to examine their racial identity development and explore their role as the perpetrators of a racist system. And so she stands out in that way. She came up with this model in 1990, and it is a very good model that has been it's been proven valid and reliable over time. When we look at how white people develop their racial identity, it's facilitated by mostly their parents, along with the larger society. So when we think about Black people, which this model was actually curated for Black people first, and then was experimented on other races to determine if they follow the same pattern. And what was found is that all groups really follow the same pattern except for white participants. And this was something that Dr. Helms found interesting and explored more. And so what was found is that in early life, from birth all the way up to probably early adulthood, college age, that white people were colorblind, that was what was promoted for them, both in schools and in home settings. And that there was rarely acknowledgement of race as a problem until they were much older and in high school or college. And that this is something that is fairly across the board, this colorblind narrative. Next is that they have some type of racialized experience that causes guilt and shame. So it's not to say that all white people don't have racialized experiences, because some white people can stay in contact their entire lives. This does not mean that they don't have racialized experiences. It just means that those racialized experiences that they encountered did not cause guilt or shame. But the emotional reaction of guilt and shame leads them into the stage that we call disintegration. The next stage is reintegration. This is where I find most of the people that I interact with in my consulting settings fall in this space. This is the blame the victim, and also whites only have privileges because they deserve them. So blame the victim is very prevalent in American society. As for the most part, our general understanding of race is very clear. We understand that racism exists, and especially we understand it as existing in the past. And when we think about today's outcomes, we often say, well, Black people are experiencing poverty because they're lazy, though they need to get a job. Or the behavior of Black children is due to poor parenting. Or community violence is Black on Black crime. Now, all of these things are really saying that Black people are in the state that they're in, not just Black, but also Latino and Indigenous, are in the state that they're in because of the poor decisions that they've made. And white people make better decisions. And so their privileges are due to the fact that they deserve them, that they make better decisions, especially around morality, and around money. And so reintegration is fairly common among white Americans. The next group that is kind of split, I have a lot of people that identify with this next category in my consulting as well. This is pseudo-independence. And so this is where people, especially those who are aware of our racist history and have educated themselves around history, they're aware that racism exists, but they want people of color to bear the responsibility of addressing racism. They say that, African-American leaders should do more in their communities to handle issues of community violence. They want African-American consultants like myself to tell them how to not be racist as organizations. That benefits me, but that's also not a good thing. And ultimately, this is a skewed way of looking at this issue. If you have systemic racism impacting certain groups, it is not their responsibility to undo racism. It's not their responsibility to take down that system. It is the responsibility of those who have created the system to dismantle that system. And so currently, a large percentage of our mainstream white population in America is on board with racism existing, but still expects people of color to bear the responsibility of addressing racism. And then we have immersion, which is something that's newly forming in our society, this idea of being anti-racist. People are reading books and they are embracing this anti-racist ideology. This is a part of immersion, which is not the ultimate or the peak of white racial identity, but it's basically an acceptance of white identity, an acceptance of the historical past and issues of racism. But the ultimate is going to be autonomy. And this is where white people are dedicating their identity, basically, to the pursuit of social justice. So I want you to reflect on where you are based on Dr. Helm's model. If you think about it, you can put it in the chat and think about which one of these identities feels most aligned with your values and how you view being white. No pressure. Let's go to the next slide. So this is another example of how race is a social construct and racial identity is something that is developed over time. It is not just in Black people or people of color. White people also have a racial identity. It's often called the invisible identity because white is considered status quo. In America, we have a high degree of cultural hegemony, which means that white values, white identity is the status quo, and even people of color are expected to reflect white values and white identity as Americans. And so this is a process that it is ongoing, especially impactful during childhood, is facilitated by parents, and is also facilitated by the larger society. In people of color, they are aware of racial differences and racial hierarchy as early as age 3, which means that the environment is playing a huge role along with parents. Go to the next slide. When we want to define the term white supremacy, first, it's the belief that the white race is inherently superior. This belief has been around for quite some time. In the 1700s and 1800s, it was considered academic to believe in the superiority of the white race. People who were going to school, especially in medicine, were, they were reading textbooks about the different categories of the races. And they were taught that white was considered superior, that only the white race had a civilization and a history, and that other groups were either semi-savage or semi-civilized, which at that time was recorded as Asian nations. And then other groups were considered savages, lacking in all civilization, history, and the two groups that were identified as savage were indigenous peoples and African nations. And this is extremely interesting because if we know anything about history, we know that African nations and indigenous peoples had very complex, organized societies. That this issue is really an issue of lack of understanding and lack of exposure. So along with this kind of academic, or what we would call scientific colonialism, saying that certain groups have culture, certain groups have civilizations, and others don't. Then we have the beginning of the social, economic, and political advantages that go along with race. So as we have textbooks and academics saying that indigenous peoples and African nations are less than and inferior and unintelligent and have no civilization, then we can say, well, it's totally appropriate to exploit them economically, to take their land, to use them as forced labor, and establish social, economic, and political control over them to the advantage of the more civilized nations. And so I do want to take some time and kind of debunk what is critical race theory and what it isn't. So first, critical race theory is not being taught in schools. It's just not. It's not being taught in K through 12. It might start because now it has so much attention, but that's not the case right now. Your 5 to 12-year-olds are not learning critical race theory in schools. Even the teachers that are teaching them are not really learning critical race theory because it is a legal theory. It was started by Derek Bell, who was the first African-American professor at Harvard Law. He began this theory in the 70s. What he was saying at the time was that racism was at the center and permanent in our legal system. And he is correct. And when we think about the origins of our legal system, much of it was dedicated to the policing of slaves. So ensuring that slaves who had escaped were brought to justice and brought back to their owners. It was also the policing of unpaid labor. So wealthy individuals would pay security, basically, to police their lands that had their unpaid workers. Those unpaid workers were both white and Black. And this is kind of our origins of policing in America. It was highly tied to the slave trade and then morphed into policing of private lands. And then over time, we created laws that were specific to white people and laws that were specific to other than white people. A good example of that is the Black Code. So after slaves were freed, then they created laws that were specific to Black people to say that they had to be in the house at a certain time, that they could not be unemployed or they would be arrested. These Black codes became the vessel of mass incarceration and convict leasing, which started the year after slavery ended. Mass incarceration is not a modern issue. It started the year after slavery ended, and the whole purpose was to align with the 13th Amendment, which said that you couldn't have forced labor unless people were incarcerated. You can go on to the next. Dr. Bell had a lot of mentees under him who definitely believed in his theory. And one of those actually coined the term critical race theory, and that's Kimberly Crenshaw. She also coined the term intersectionality. And what she says about critical race theory, you can go to the next one, Laura, is that it's not about diversity and inclusion. It is a theory that says that our legal system is inherently racist, and that the role of race and racism is deeply embedded in our legal system, which accounts for mass incarceration and sentencing disparities, and also over-policing and over-surveillance in areas that are mostly Black and Brown. And that it also is a critique of the social construct of race, saying that, as we in America have this belief that Black people are more likely to become criminals or engage in criminal behavior than white people, that is actually the environments that have been created since slaves have been freed that is perpetrating higher rates of crime. And that we have what she would call a racial caste system here in America. And that our racial caste system means that different races get different treatment when it comes to our legal system. And this is something that has been very clearly proven through research, that our legal system is inherently racist, that we over-police areas that are Black and Brown, that we have lighter sentences for white people, especially white women. And this is something that is very much proven. And so this is what critical race theory is. It is a legal theory that is taught in law schools, not K-12 education, and is not really taught to teachers in any real way. You can go to the next slide. What critical race theory is essentially saying is that white supremacy is deeply embedded in our society. It's also saying that racism is institutional. So racism is not someone calling you a slur on the street, but it is the policies and the systemic issues that make it harder, that make your life harder because of your skin color. It is also asserting that America's power structure was built to marginalize people of color, that it didn't just happen by accident, but there are clear policies and doctrines that were purposely constructed to ensure economic, social, and political power for white people over other races. And it also says that race is a social construct, that is, there is no genetic race, but that race is just really being used as a tool to stratify power.
So thank you so much, Ingrid. That is such a great foundation for our discussion, because I believe strongly and in our discussions around this, that all of the things that you just shared with us are heavily impacting the kind of panic and hysteria that's going on in communities around what they think critical race theory is being taught to young children, like you said, a theory taught in law schools, not even being taught to teachers. So how is this actually playing out, besides what I mentioned at the beginning in terms of, all the laws being passed and the effects on individual teachers and curriculum decisions? There was a really excellent article that came out last week. NBC did a study that showed that the schools that were facing the biggest uproar over teaching of critical race theory were in districts that had diversified the quickest, the most rapid. And the analysis of the study showed that it was really based in white fear, like this fear of the white identity and what it meant to be white and what was happening to their community, that was really causing this backlash against DEI inclusion issues or curriculum choices. That really was what their conclusion. And this Slate did an article about the NBC, but these are quotes from the actual NBC study across the country. And I pulled out the ones that I think really, for me, resonated with the points that you made above, that so conservative activists have used and have co-opted or taken this term of critical race theory to describe any discussion of race and gender that they believe are too progressive, too radical, too social justice minded. The folks that are against this see the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives or culturally relevant teaching practices. They see that their activism is an effort to protect America's kids from racist indoctrination. And I think this is really fascinating, and I'd love for you to talk about this a little bit, Ingrid, that it seems as though the opponents to this kind of inclusion in schools are using language against us, like using the same language of racism. So they're saying that this practice is racist.
Yeah, it is. Sometimes as a person of color, I can feel that this is intentional at this level, but it's not really. It is a reflection of indoctrination. America has done a lot of work at the higher levels of policy and our larger values, that macro system, to ensure that we have this narrative of American exceptionalism, that we've turned all the negative things about America into a very clear story of redemption. So, oh yeah, we used to be racist and we overcame that, and now we're good. Racism is over. And only in America can you overcome racism like we have. Like there's this very clear narrative. And so whenever we go against that, or we want to actually address racism in real ways, then there's going to be pushback because we have already declared mission accomplished when it comes to racism. And often, and this is why people who believe this often use or quote Martin Luther King, and they talk about people should be judged by their works, by their morals and their character. And what they're essentially saying is, if we say that we've addressed racism, then that means that poor Latino families, Black families, Indigenous families, that they just have poor morals and make bad decisions, and that's why they're in the issue, dealing with the issues that they're dealing with. And it's not about skin color anymore. That is how that's translating for them, and they really believe that. And there's also this protection of white identity that really translates to the protection of their children's identity. And this is a real issue that is a hard pill to swallow. And is a reflection of, chickens coming home to roost. This is what happens when you have a racist history, that eventually things will come back around. And now you will have to deal with issues generationally. And so Black and brown people have been racially socializing their children in a negative way throughout centuries, saying you're going to have to work 10 times as hard to be successful. You're going to have to, look a certain way, talk a certain way, behave a certain way to be successful, and putting basically all of the responsibility of dealing with racism on young children so that they can survive. When you encounter the police, you need to do X, Y, and Z. When you're at school, you can't do X, Y, and Z. You can't talk this way. You can't walk this way. And just putting all of the pressure of racism on children at a very young age, which is unfair, to say the least, that they have to bear the brunt of trying to avoid racism with their actions, which is also just unrealistic. In addition to that, but there is a psychological cost to that, which is all the things that we're talking about: impact on IQ, impact on behavior, impact on health outcomes. As Black children, brown children deal with the stress of that, and it begins early in life. Whereas white children, they don't have to deal with any of that. They are relatively free from having to go through racial socialization because of this invisible identity, which allows them to just develop without the stress of what it means to be white. Critical race theory represents that changing for white parents, that they will have to reckon with the past of putting people into groups by race. Unfortunately, white people have created this system, and it may be possible that their children will have to deal with it, that they will be judged on the actions of their ancestors. And this could have a negative impact on their racial identity. And so white parents are definitely trying to avoid that, and I don't blame them. But Black parents and Latino parents and Indigenous parents don't have that luxury.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely one of the things that I've heard come up most often in the news, and even in communities around me across the country, is that fear of making children feel bad for something they weren't responsible for. You know, I don't want my child to feel bad about being white. They didn't enslave people, right? They're not directly responsible. And I think that's probably one of the most common things I've heard. And that kind of relates to the quote at the bottom I pulled out, because it's from a mom, you know, saying that, you know, our kids, kind of like what you said in showing us that identity model, that our kids don't see race. We're the ones being racist, that we are as adults overthinking this, our hyper focus on race is only going to make us more divisive. And that seems to really resonate with kind of what you laid out before and what you were just talking about. But I pulled these out of the article because I think these really, for me, stood out as what I've heard across the country, watching the news, reading different articles, you know, listening to it even in our own community here in Los Angeles. Like, this keeps coming up around both, you know, calling attention to these things. We are being the ones, now we're the ones that are being racist. We're being divisive by calling attention to the gaps in our history or what we're teaching in schools, and that we are responsible for creating guilt and fear and shame in white children by, you know, in being inclusive in what kind of history we teach in schools. So I found that really interesting. And then the last thing I pulled out was just, like I said, Slate did an article about that NBC report. And again, this is what I pulled out that really resonated from kind of what we talked about before, that this is really motivated by they may not articulate it this way, but that desire to protect whiteness, to protect the privilege, and that they don't see that as being racist, but protective. This, I heard it put this way the other day, and I thought it was great, right? The other CRT, so culturally responsive teaching, is not critical race theory. And that's really what we're seeing going on is this, I think a positive increase in culturally responsive teaching methods, and especially around history and literature. And I'll give you some examples. So these are examples of curriculum that has been designed over the years to supplement textbooks, which are historically inaccurate and tend to leave out lots and lots of information that are facts, right? They tell a very specific story with a very specific agenda. And most of the textbooks are made in Texas and distributed to all of our classrooms across the country. And so teachers have had to go out of their way to include history and literature topics that fall outside the general knowledge that's being dispersed by our textbooks. And this is often what is called, radical teaching, activist teaching, activist civics, right? That if we include these topics, and thank goodness, that these organizations have created this for us. We don't, as history teachers, which is what I used to be, we don't have to recreate the wheel. And, I don't know if I can ultimately say that textbooks are getting any better, but there's definitely been an effort to include more. There's places like Learning for Justice and all of the intersectionality that you talked about. They have curriculum for any grade level in these topics. And that's amazing. Like, that's great. I wish we didn't have to go outside to a nonprofit organization to be able to access curriculum, right? That for me fills the gaps that exist in our national curriculum. But I think the next one is a great example. I often hear, so this is the Zen Education Project created curriculum around teaching about the Tulsa Massacre. And I think this year, especially, and with people watching the HBO show The Watchmen, they're like, I've never heard of the Tulsa Massacre before until I watched this show, or I now, with the commemorization this past year on the news, right? Oh, why didn't I learn about this in school? I can't believe I'm, 50 years old and learning about this for the first time. How come this wasn't? Because it's a fact. We're not denying, or, we're not debating that this happened. But these kinds of things that are actual, fact and truth, like you said, the truth telling don't show up in our teaching. And I think that the rise in more inclusive teaching is part of what's creating this confusion and this backlash. So the more that those parents are seeing these types of topics, this is what they're talking about. When you teach this, you make my child feel bad about their whiteness because this, atrocity was perpetrated on African Americans by white people. So that's, I think, one of the things, and like I said, that, the South Dakota governor saying, well, we're going to pause on all of our social studies standards now and let all of the constituents weigh in on what topics are allowed and not allowed, right? And this is, I think, really what she's afraid of, is that if we're going to teach the true Indigenous history of South Dakota, it's not going to be so pretty for most of the folks that live there currently that are white, right? And there's a fear around the shame that may be created if they teach an inclusive curriculum there. So those are just my kind of observations of what I've seen culturally. I'm going to stop sharing because now we get to have a discussion with all of you. And I know some of the some comments and questions have already started coming in, and we encourage you to either put questions or comments in the chat, or you can raise your hand and Porter will help to unmute you. Ingrid, any thoughts, comments?
I think that my main thought when it comes to this issue is just wrestling with, I have a psychology background, and so I understand that people do a lot of things unconsciously, and but I'm always wrestled with this issue of accountability and the changing of the narrative when it comes to people of color in this country. It is, when we look at the news, we're depicted in a certain way. Obviously, when it comes to research, there's a lot of deficit research on our health, on our educational attainment, on our economic viability, and it is often researched, and white people have the luxury of not being researched as the perpetrators of a racist system. And they are able to escape accountability. And so we can't have it both ways. We can't say that race exists, right? So, our construct of race, again, was created by white men in the 1800s in Europe. And now that construct no longer, or seemingly no longer, serves white people or our mainstream society, we want to say, oh no, we can't talk about race in this way anymore. Now we need to move to colorblindness, even though we have still all of the fallout from that period still here. So if we're going to say that we're going to embrace colorblindness and then we're going to leave racism behind, then that means we have to reconcile. We have to have reparations. We have to acknowledge the past and put things in place to become accountable before we can move forward. We can't just say, oh, all these issues are issues of morality and good decision-making and character now, because we're ready to get rid of this construct and embrace colorblindness fully. And so it is definitely something I'm conflicted about. And I'm also very weirded out about the very clear history that we have that is being negated by some. So when we lay out the history, the facts of the matter, and still say, well, America's not a racist country, that is baffling to me. It seems like a mental disorder.
I think that's not inaccurate to say. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I have the same, having been a former activist history teacher, as they would accuse me of, I totally relate to that. All right, I would love, Porter, do you see some comments, questions that you'd like to bring up?
Sure. We've had a couple comments. I'm going to just try to go in order as much as I can. So Chris had a comment that I will share and then take off mute in case you would like to edit it. But the question is, are there any prototype letters to the editor about CRT that can start the common message about what it is to factually, and what it is, so a factual and clarifying message grows across our country? And Chris, I will also take you off mute in case you want to add anything.
No, I bring that up because I'm asked that often. Like, this has been a wonderful presentation. I've taken lots of notes. We'll appreciate the slides. And as a former school board member, educator, I can do this on my own. But often people that may want to engage just need something extra that they can make their own. And I'm just wondering if PACES is working on possibly some prototypes of what people could use for letters to the editor or opinion pieces, so that we can start becoming the voice instead of hearing the clutter.
Wow, what a great quote. I love that, Chris. You're right. I mean, what a great idea, because I think that's kind of what you said is what spurred me to have this as our very first conversation, because this is having such real impact legislatively and through our school boards. It's not just a conversation that's harmless or that people are getting. I mean, this is having real big impacts on our districts and on our state policy. And I think you're right. Right now, we've been kind of the clutter, right? We need to become the voice that actually can push back against this, because there's 20 other states that are considering this legislation among the 8 that have already passed it. And that is something we need to respond to. I really appreciate that suggestion.
I would just like to see if we could make it easier for people to engage, because lots of people are just overwhelmed.
Yes, I'm taking notes.
Yeah, I would say here in Tennessee is one of the states that has banned critical race theory in schools for no reason, because again, it wasn't being taught. But I'm here in Tennessee, and what we did is we had a response letter that we sent to our governor and our governing bodies to be very clear about what critical race theory is, but more importantly, what the real implications of trying to tell only one story. And so Tennessee has a lot of rich history. And so if we leave out a great chunk of the history around the different things that have played out here in Tennessee specifically, then we are not allowing our children to be full citizens, and also to ensure that we don't have the same mistakes moving forward. We need to be able to paint a picture for them to say, okay, these are the issues that are impacting our state. Our state is very low in educational attainment. I think we're 48. We have poor health. All of these things are kind of tied together. And so if we really want to address the problems of our state, we would have to be fully aware of our history and all the different ways that our history impacts us today. And a definite part of that is racism. And so what does it mean to try to cut out this history that we don't appreciate? The ramifications we don't know yet. And so it's very important to just have a whole picture that's painted with our history, so that we can make sure that we have a healthy state. And so that was really the direction that we went in when we made that letter.
One of the comments from Martin, who's actually the one that joined us from the UK, and I think really relates to some of the pushback that we've heard here, Ingrid, and I know you've talked about this before, is the idea around white poverty, right? And that their educational outcomes are sometimes poorer than Black peers, or you saying that that's what's happening in the UK, which is allowing conservative politicians to argue that racism isn't structural. That oh, look, the poor white folks are doing worse. And I know I used to teach in a very poor white community, and that was definitely a strong feeling there. You know, we're suffering just as much. I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And I know that you've had some good thoughts about that in the past.
Well, it's a complex issue. So when we think about poverty in general, you know, we have more white people than we have people of color currently. That is changing, but especially in the past, there's just more numbers. So even if we think about disproportionality, it's disproportionate the amount of people of color who are living in poverty. And the reason that is the case is because, the people of color being marginalized. And there's also no need to engage in kind of, my oppression is worse than your oppression. But there's very clear linkage between white poverty and policies that are put in place to kind of marginalize certain groups. One of the real ways that this happens is that racism allows for low wages. So when we think about when slaves were freed and they left from the South in what we call the Great Migration because of the poor treatment they were having in the South, they moved into the Midwest and the North and the West. And there was immediate, one of the issues with Tulsa, Oklahoma was there was economic issues, that the poor white laborers were very upset about the prosperity that Black people were having as they moved in. And that was because, people, these large industries, these manufacturing companies, they were paying for people to come up from the South. They were wooing them, but they weren't paying them as much as they paid white people, which drove down the wages. So now I have to pay a white man, $10 a month, and I can bring in a Black person, pay them $5, $3. That's a huge difference. And the racism is then allowed for these low wages to be an issue across the board. Even still today, we're still dealing with that. And so because of racism, that means that I can find someone who's undocumented and pay them less, which then cuts into jobs and opportunities for everyone, not just for people of color, but for everyone, for white people who have a higher standard of pay. This is a problem for everybody. And it's because of racism that this happens. Well, racism / capitalism, but that's a whole other discussion. And so if we look at how the intentional marginalization of certain groups then impacts disadvantaged white people, then we see that connection. As long as we are allowed to pay certain groups less, then that means that it, as a large corporation, then it behooves me to employ Black people and take advantage of them, or to have undocumented workers and pay them nothing, or engage in sharecropping, which was really big after slavery ended, where it's basically unpaid labor, but you get to be on my land. And as long as we allow that to happen, then that means poor white people also suffer. And America has kind of cut off its nose to spite its face when it comes to that. All the different ways that we have tried to marginalize people of color has definitely impacted poor white people and has definitely benefited very wealthy white people.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because that definitely that discussion comes up a lot. All right, folks. So what else is on your mind? How is this impacting you in your communities? Carrie, I see your hand up.
Hi there. So I was talking to an educational leader yesterday in Indiana, and I just brought up if they were needing some technical assistance on trauma. And what he said was shocking to me, because he said, yes, because SEL is now being taken over as this is a way that teachers and schools are going to push CRT. And it's like, what?
Wow.
So he literally said, so now we have to call it trauma focused. And I'm like, wait a second, if we just let people take over all of the factual words that we're using for good, what are we left with? And so I just wanted to bring that up. It was surprising to me that apparently it's happening in Indiana.
Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that one. Thanks for illuminating that for sure. Huh. And yeah, SEL has a whole bunch of, Pam, you've heard that in Wisconsin as well.
Porter, do we have any more questions in the chat?
I know Amber, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, I'm sorry, Schellenberger, has made several comments, and some of those included questions just throughout. And so I made a note of one of those. And so I will go ahead and pose that. And then Amber, I will take you off mute or ask you to unmute if you want to add to that. But one of the questions that you posed earlier, I believe it was when Ingrid was speaking, was, I know you mentioned fear, but how do you see pride or fear of losing power playing a role in all of this from white people?
And she just added a follow-up of how would you suggest interacting those folks that are driven by fear, which I think is a really great question.
Yeah, so the fear element is a very good question. And it really ties to kind of what I was saying before about turning things on its head. We talk about intergenerational or historical trauma being passed along through generations amongst people of color, but it's also passed along through white people as well. And so white fear of people of color is an intergenerational trauma. It is something that you can imagine as white children were watching their parents engage with indigenous people, and the same with freed slaves. There's always been this fear narrative. And you would also think that those white children would have questions at those lynchings that we see, those white children in those photographs of lynchings that they were there and witnessed that. You would think that they would have questions. You would think they would have questions during the genocide of indigenous peoples. And, you know, you would believe that those parents at the time, those white parents told those children that one of several things. First, that Black and brown people were less than, that they were animals, that they were the enemy, that they were inferior, that they would hurt them if they had the opportunity. All the different ways they would account for what they were doing at the time. And so then that is passed on through generations. And some of you still have these leftover lingering implicit issues around people of color now that probably come from your grandparents and your parents that show up at these holidays. We have Thanksgiving coming up and things of that nature. And these are very real messages that are sent down through generations that are housed in our DNA. You know, it's not just people of color who have intergenerational transmission. And so this fear is real. It's not, it's passed down through generations. Same thing with pride, the belief that the white race is superior. That's AKA pride. That's the same thing that's being passed down through generations as we, from parent to child over hundreds of years. So that's what we're talking about, is that intergenerational transmission. Is as we think about those endemic problems in Black and Latino communities and how hard they are to solve, you can think that that's the same thing with white communities around pride and fear, and other ways that all the negative impacts of white supremacy and racism has on white communities as well. It's the same issue.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. I wanted to mention, because I feel like as a white person growing up in a small town in the South, I definitely ran into that. And it wasn't until college when I had to have really uncomfortable conversations with people when I was like, this is my reality. And they were like, that's not everyone else's reality. And I think, it infuriates me still that I feel like someone could have had that conversation with me as a child, to explain, like, not everyone feels the way that you do. and not everyone has had the advantages or like the safety that you've felt. And so either way, I greatly appreciate your response and am absolutely still infuriated by everything going on, but glad that we at least have people that we want to do something about it. So thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you. And I also want to talk a little bit about the interacting, because that's a very difficult one. Like, what does it mean to interact with people who have these very different beliefs from you?
And are so fear-based. Right?
And yeah. And I really don't have an answer for it. It's very complex, but just having an understanding of where that fear comes from is helpful, as opposed to, you're just a bigot or you're racist and all these other names that don't help to facilitate conversations. On the other end of that, it is very clear that one group is playing a different game than the other. And so a good example of this is, I talked with a school system in Chicago, and they were like, we have teachers who have obvious white supremacist ideology that they're teaching and projecting in classes. What should we do about it? And I was like, well, do you have policy that outlines what white supremacist ideology is? Because other than that, well, what would you be able to do about it? You don't have policy. And you see one group is playing the policy game really well, and the other one is not. And so it's going to be a different type of game than just thinking you can interact with someone one-on-one and make change. It's going to be about a change in policy and a change in the way that things are done, and and adopting the tactics of your enemy, like the art of war kind of thing. And I hate to use, because that's not very trauma-informed wording, but again, the different sides are playing two very different games. And this is something that's been the case for a long time, when we have one group who is very clear on messaging, they're all in line, they're addressing policy, they have a very clear way of addressing this issue, and the other is talking about it.
Yep, I agree. And I think that gets to what Chris was pointing out, that we need to become a little bit more active in our role at the policy level, a school board level. I think this is a great conversation. All right, what else? Brian, did you want to say something? I know you put in the chat.
Me, I always like to say things first, just appreciations for the level of discourse that we're engaging in here, because of the complexities and the nuances that we're understanding. And I think the only question that I didn't pose, because I didn't know how to say it, was, you used the phrase, Ingrid, in my mind, rugged individualism, like this narrative, like pull your own bootstraps up dimension of it. And I think there's a complicating dimension too, when there's middle class people of color that also sort of use the Dr. King quote, and then that clip or snippet of a person of color voicing something along the content of character naming becomes even a complicating factor in the larger narrative. And I guess any thoughts about how those moments do or do not advance, or just that moment that I observe sometimes that's complicated to hold?
Yeah, so I don't think it's exactly complicated. When we talk about implicit bias in these larger ideas about what it means to be American, and white bias, positive white bias in America, I think, let's see, Harvard has one for implicit bias, and it's been around for quite some time. And 75% of all the people who have taken that implicit bias assessment had a positive white bias. And that means the people of color as well. And so everybody is being impacted by this system when it comes to ideology, not just white people. So there are plenty of people of color who have taken on white supremacist ideas because they live in America, because that's what we're doing here. And so if I'm, like when I said before about children of color being able to say that white people are nicer, that they're smarter, that they're more attractive at the age of 3, that is a reflection of what they're getting from their environment. Their parents are not telling them that. Their parents aren't saying, hey, white people are friendlier. This is something that they're seeing in their schools and in their neighborhoods. And what they're reflecting on is that one group is a little less oppressed than the other. And so being less oppressed will make you happier and more likely to smile and easier to interact and have more money and all the positive things that we think of that come along with being an American. So it's kind of like Stockholm syndrome. Of course, if I'm here in America and I see certain groups prospering, then I would say I should take on the ideology of these groups so that I too can be successful. And that ideology is that pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with racism or not, kind of thing. And that's very common, especially in successful people of color, because that is what equates to success in America, is this abandoning of your cultural identity to take on the beliefs of the larger system, regardless if they're positive or not, because that's how you're going to get the job, right? You're going to have to straighten your hair. You're going to have to, change the way you dress. You're going to have to make sure that you code switch and talk as white as possible. All of these things are very clear messages to people of color as to what makes you more successful. And so I don't think it's strange. I think it's adaptive.
That's a good word to use. Porter, anyone? Oh, I see someone has their hand raised.
Yeah, we have one person with their hand raised and someone else that submitted.
I have my hand raised. Hello.
Hi.
In the beginning of the presentation, it talked about how parenting to protect the safety of your child, especially historically through slavery, keep your head down, do what you're told, maybe some of these other lessons that might be very different from white families: assert yourself, let your voice be heard, advocate for yourself. I mean, those are opposites. We've heard about parenting in the general media since George Floyd. Have you had the talk with your kid about what you do when you're pulled over? But as a collective impact initiative that provides trauma-informed parenting classes, I would be interested to hear what additional resources there could be, or how we could be more culturally responsive to these patterns that are so ingrained perhaps in some families versus other families simply because of history, or just anything more about the differences in parenting that have, legitimate genesis of those strategies.
Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of monopolizing the conversation, so I just want to check in with Laura.
No,
Okay.
This is great. Yeah.
So actually my field of research from grad school was African-American parenting practices. And this is how I got to the point where I even knew about what historical trauma was and how I got to understand about ACEs. But basically, this very extreme survival-based parenting style is a lot more than just, how parents talk to their children. It's very complex. It is, attachment style. So, it's a tough world out there. So sorry, newborn, I can't hold you all the time when you're crying. This is like a reflection of like families that say, oh, just let the baby cry it out versus make sure you hold your baby when they're crying. I mean, this is very fundamental to your view of the world, right? So if I have a survival-based parenting style that's deeply rooted in slavery and Jim Crow and racism in America, or if I'm an Indigenous person whose parenting style is deeply rooted in separation and assimilation, then I'm going to have a hard time attaching with my child from the beginning. I'm going to, let them cry it out as opposed to holding them, because in my mind, I'm preparing them for this harsh racist world that they're going to experience. I'm preparing them to be separated from me early in age. I'm preparing them to have to deal with the adversity of their skin color. All of this is amounting to this idea that I have to toughen you up at home so you can experience the tough world. That equates to using physical punishment more than other groups. So more spanking, more control. So if you think, your child's playing in the yard, they get too close to the street, do I say, hey, little Bobby, come back over here from the street? Or do I go and get you and grab you by the arm and pull you back over? The survival-based parent is going to go and get you, grab you by the arm and pull you over, because they're going to be more likely to feel like they have to use force, be hands-on. The other parent, sees there's no car on the street, it's not a big deal, and it's better for you to be able to respond to my voice and have your own sense of control versus me coming and grabbing you. These different parenting styles are preparing people for very different worlds. One group is more assertive, happier, less oppressed, feels more loved at home. I said feels more because people of color love their children just as much as other parents. And then the other group is very aware of how they're being stifled because of their color or because of their neighborhood or because of the parenting style. So it's very clear that when we're talking about what does it mean to have parenting trainings when it comes to this issue, is just to tell the truth about history. And that's the part that people don't want to address. It's all about avoiding talking about the root cause, right? So if you are doing parent training in groups that are mostly Black parents and you're not talking about slavery, you're not addressing root cause. You are talking about tactics that they should use, which they may or may not use, but just imagine how much motivation you would have if you say that these parenting practices are tied to shorter life expectancy and that the root cause is the racist system that you live in. That's going to be a little bit different than saying, when your child is crying, do X, Y, and Z, because believe me, grandma is telling them you need to beat them, or you need to hit them, or you need to do something that is rooted in these, survival-based parenting, which is not a bad thing. It's not negative to be survival-based. It is adaptive. It's appropriate. It means that, I'm in an environment where I don't feel safe and I have to parent my child in that way. Unfortunately, when it comes to parenting practices, they are passed down through generations. So even when the element is no longer there, that parenting practice still lingers. So even though we're not in slavery or Jim Crow, or if a family is living in a dangerous neighborhood and then moves into a nicer neighborhood, the parenting practices still lingers. So you have to talk root cause, not tactics. Both of them, but definitely you have to talk root cause.
Wow, yeah, that is so spot on. And till I became a parent, I didn't realize how much judgment was in the world about parenting either. That certainly is amplified when we're talking about, different communities and how they parent. And I love what you said, Ingrid, about root cause and telling the truth, because I really think that's the message that we're talking about across the board here. I mean, that's what's causing so much reaction, right? I mean, schools are trying to talk about root cause in history and literature. Schools are trying, lots of, amazing, excellent teachers are doing their best to talk about the truth. They're using primary sources. They're not indoctrinating anybody, but that's the language that's being used against them. But this is their attempt to get at root cause in understanding the complexities that our children are well aware exist around them, no matter who they are, what they can see around them. And I think in my experience with young people, regardless of where I've taught, they want this kind of conversation. They're mad that people don't have these kind of conversations with them, kind of like I think it was someone brought up before, Amber, you know, until you get to college, but in high school and middle school, kids are well equipped to begin these conversations, to explore the complexities around them. They talk about engagement. You know, they will sleep through a textbook lesson, but if you start talking about the things they see in their world reflected, especially with social media, you know, this is all reflected around them. And when you take the opportunity to really dive in with them and talk about root cause, you know, at their developmental level, they respond and can handle the complexities that we're trying to explore. They can handle it for sure. So I think that to me is the message from today too, is that this exploration of root cause is provoking a lot of fear, and thinking about how we, I love this suggestion, you know, how we understanding that the person in front of us is responding from a fear, you know, in their nervous system, right? Their fear-based defense mobilized system against what they feel is coming at them, or the protective nature around their children, and exploring it through this identity lens and root cause and what we understand going around us, and then responding, also changing the game that we're playing, because you're right now we're talking about it. So how do we move from talking about this and kind of, I feel like we're, even myself, like late to the game. I'm like, wait, what? 8 states just passed legislation in the last week? What the heck? I was sleeping. What happened? You know, it happened so quickly. I'm like, oh my God, we're asleep at the wheel. We need to figure out how to collectively respond in the same, and play the same game. That is really another message I really took to heart from today. We have 2 minutes left. So any last thoughts, put them in the chat. One word, I would ask you to put in one word that comes to mind when you think about today's discussion. How did this feel for you? That would be great as a little way for us to know how we did. And we will share, this has been recorded, so we'll share this with you all. And we will have one discussion like this every month on different topics around current events that are going on, using a trauma-informed and PACES science-informed lens around education. So we hope you join us again. And any follow-up questions, I'm just going to share one last slide because it has our contact information on it. Right, hold on one second, what happened? Woo. Can you see me? Anyway. I'll put them in the chat while we're, at least mine. Because if any questions come up, feel free to email me. All right, everyone. Well, with that, we'll just let it roll. If you have any last comments, Ingrid put her email in there as well. And otherwise, we'll see you in October. I do believe our subject for October will be youth mental health and school mental health, and what does that really mean? So I'm excited to dive into that. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Have a great week. Yeah, I agree with you, Diane. I'm so glad people asked questions in mid comments. Thank you, Amber. Thanks for contributing. Thank you. Thanks, Connie.
Laura, do you want to debrief?
Yeah, we can stay on shortly for a minute. You too, Porter, if you have a minute. And in a second, for those of you that are still here, we're going to probably put y'all in the waiting room. And anyone, unless anyone has one last question they were too shy to ask. All right. This will take me a second here. Make sure I don't accidentally put one of you in the waiting room. All right, thank you. All right, guys, so what do you think?
Yeah, I think it went good. We managed to stay on our time thing. I
We
feel like I
did.
went over, but we did stay on our time.
Yeah, you really didn't.
I felt like I was like, well, I'm talking a long time.
Yeah, I know it can feel, especially when it feels like there's one block, of content that belongs to you specifically. I know it can feel that way too. So we can think about that too, like how I can break that up for someone, for a guest, even if they are setting the stage, for 25 minutes or whatever.
Yeah. Porter, what did you think?
I thought it was really good. I thought y'all did great with time. I was surprised by that too. I was expecting more questions